Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. 2024 will go down as the biggest election year in history, with more than 2 billion people casting ballots across the globe. The year also saw inflation and interest rates easing across much of the world, even while geopolitical tensions remained high. So what might 2025 have in store? With me now to look ahead to the year to come are Keyu, author and associate professor at the London School of Economics, David J. Firestein, president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations, and Rana, ST Lead Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you all for coming on the agenda. Keyu, let me start with you. 2024 was a huge year for elections around the world, and for the most part, incumbent parties did badly, from the Democrats in the US who lost to others forced into cohabitation like in France, or into coalitions like in India and in South Africa. There's a big weight of expectation, isn't there, on whether leaders can deliver on what they promised for 2025, principally, of course, Donald Trump.
Yes, indeed. I think the big change from the past few decades is that where economics drove politics, we are now in a world where politics drive economics. And so that has become a real, new national agendas around the world. Whether it's political issues, social issues, it seems like growth, at least in the past few years leading up to current days, have not been on the priority list for many of these countries. Many countries have given up the growth agenda. And indeed, one can understand why. There are huge, massive issues, whether it's discontents of globalization or technological advances, inequality, climate change, and so forth. But we're really seeing a shift of priorities towards national security and political and social issues. And I think that whether these leaders can deliver, but also will prioritize economics above and beyond anything else, is still very much in question.
Well, if, David, as Keyu says, politics is going to drive economics, what does Trump's second term mean for the global economy?
Well, I think it means a couple of things for sure. One is uncertainty, and another is unpredictability, because this is someone that we know from his first term and from his public life over the last decade will often throw curveballs, even at his own team, let alone the nation and the world. And this is someone who is an instinctive leader and who does things in a way that are often unscripted, speaks in a way that's very unconventional, and has policy ideas and initiatives that are very different from anything that we've ever seen in any former any other previous U.S. president. So I think there is a big X factor that is associated with Donald Trump, and we could see a lot of different things. But I think that if we look at the trajectory that we saw coming out of his first term in office, I think a number of the policies that he has advocated for and proposed and says that he's going to implement as president in his second term are going to be very problematic for the global economy and for the U.S. economy, not least the issue of tariffs, which everyone understands, except apparently for President Trump, are going to be inflationary at the levels that he's talking about and very damaging to the U.S. and global economy. So I think unpredictability, but also potentially some serious problems stemming from some of his flagship policies.
Rana, I can see you nodding away there. So when it comes to that unpredictability and those curveballs, Trump has been very vocal about new steep tariffs on China, on Mexico, on Canada. How do you see Trump's impact on the rest of the world, Asia in particular?
Sure. Well, I think actually that some of the stories that both Keyu and David have been talking about, particularly about the way in which tariffs and trade are coming together and fear or perhaps apprehension about globalization, are global wide, but I would say that Asia is going to be where a lot of those stories really are going to come to a crunch situation. I think that one of the things that's going to be most interesting in the year to come, and actually probably for the decade to come, certainly the next 4 years of President Trump's second term, will be a story about how economics and energy come together. Because if Vice President Harris had been elected president, then I think that the direction of travel of the Biden administration, which was very much towards so-called Green New Deal, the Inflation Reduction Act, which essentially was pushing a lot of investment towards post-fossil fuel energy, would probably have continued. Now, the indications that we talk about unpredictability, but one thing that I think actually the Trump team has been pretty predictable about is the idea that they want to go back to a fossil fuel-based economy, not only internally in the United States, but also in terms of exports. I think the phrase "drill, baby, drill" has been used more than once. Probably familiar to David, who I know lives in Texas, a state where I think that phrase may have originated. What does that mean? Well, it means that the US is going to become, as it was perhaps back in the 70s and 80s, half a century ago, the champion of fossil fuel-based energy and technology, whereas China is probably going to consolidate where it is now, which is a dominance in solar, wind turbines, and other areas that have to do with green technology. Now, I'm going to cast perhaps some unwelcome note of optimism into the proceedings by saying that I think this is going to give a lot of opportunities for other parts of Asia. In other words, the emergent economies of Southeast Asia, ASEAN and others who are desperate to get really good energy narratives, energy trajectories out of the wider world. And I think they'll be in a better position now to be basically looking at the US and China and saying, well, you need to start thinking both about what we want, what we need with our younger populations, our need for new employment, our energy hunger. How are you going to satisfy that? I think that's where the decisions in the end about which geopolitical energy choice has really been most economically effective is going to be made. It'll be fascinating in the next year to see how that works out.
It's interesting you're talking there about China driving the green transition, perhaps more so than the United States and other parts of the world. I want to talk about the electric vehicle row then between the EU and China and how that's going to continue into 2025. Keyu, how do you see that playing out and what economic impact could that have?
Well, first, let me say that I think there's still room for negotiation. I mean, what we have seen with China's success, first of all, in manufacturing, and now combining its scale and unique political economy model to come out with the most innovative and accessible, affordable new energy technology, is just like the first time China shock, also a shock to the world because of its sheer dominance. At the same time, the green transition is the priority or so-called priority of especially Europe and the world. And there's a huge dilemma, to be honest, I think, among policymakers in thinking about whether to embrace China because it brings not only the technology and the products, but also the know-how. It's very ironic that it's really the other way around. When China couldn't do combustion engine vehicles and wanted to import technology, now the Europeans are requiring technological transfers in some circumstances. So it's really flipping the situation completely around. But, China is still very much about competition, about accessing European markets. So they're willing to confer some of these technological know-hows as well as joint investments and making these kind of progress in Europe. So I think there's still a lot to be negotiated, but also very broadly, as Rana also mentioned, as the U.S. might, for the moment, sideline the green transition and the new energy movement, China will certainly pick up the baton and be definitely more aggressive about it.
So EVs, green tech, clean tech. But David, I wonder what other key sectors should we be watching in terms of global trade?
Well, I think the broad trend line that we've obviously seen in the United States and around the world to a certain degree, but I'd say nowhere more than in the United States, is this idea that somehow globalization is bad and that it's damaging and harmful to the United States and to the American worker. So I think anything that relates to, in particular, two areas is going to be a focus of the Trump administration as they embark on their second term. And one is the technology area writ large. You've mentioned EVs, but there's a huge sensitivity now in the United States to any notion of what is perceived as undue dependence on an adversary, if not an enemy. That is the undue dependence of the United States on China in areas of that relate to sensitive technologies or foundational technologies that really matter for the 21st century economy. I think there's going to be a continued trend in the direction of moving away from that real or perceived dependence. Whether or not that is good for this country economically, there is a sense that our security depends and necessitates a move away from that dependency on China. And in terms of an issue that's more politically or as politically resonant, the issue of manufacturing. I think there's a narrative in this country that we've lost massive amounts of manufacturing jobs to China. And it's obviously been a theme of the Trump rhetoric dating back to 2015 and his entry into the 2016 race and his presidency. And we've seen that narrative continue even during the Biden administration. And so I think both technology and manufacturing are going to be areas where the United States is going to continue to try to reduce real or perceived dependence on China and hedge against the notion of depending to an undue degree on an adversary that is deemed unreliable and that is deemed to have nefarious intent with respect to the United States.
And Rana, while we're talking about technology, there's another potential big issue, isn't there, between China and the United States? The world's fastest growing social site, TikTok, set to drop off US app stores on January the 19th. What impact do you think that's going to have? I mean, some have suggested that's going to cost the US billions of dollars, but there's a big conversation to be had there, isn't there, Rana?
I think there is, although it's not clear quite what direction the new administration is going to go. I mean, President Trump actually, TikTok was still very much around already in his first term, and he went back and forth in terms of what he wanted to do about it. And I suspect that in his own upcoming administration, I mean, he hasn't yet indicated which direction he wants to go, but some of those who are appointed to foreign policy positions, Secretary of State Marco Rubio in particular, are clearly, I think, in the camp that would be very wary of Chinese technology being widely available in the US. It's not clear what the position of Elon Musk, big entrepreneur, figure who's been given a sort of the Department of Government Efficiency is called, which actually technically is not actually a department of the US government, but has a sort of supervisory or advisory status. And he, of course, has significant investment in China and China's technology. So he may well take a different view. We don't yet know which way that's going to go. In terms of what might happen, I mean, it's a really interesting question because actually there's plenty of evidence that points both ways. It's worth noting that most US tech majors have essentially been shut out of the Chinese market for 10 years or more. Google no longer operates there. Facebook doesn't operate there. You can't use WhatsApp there. And actually that's created an ecology in China with its own apps, famously WeChat, Bilibili, Youku, Kuaishou, all sorts of names like this that have grown up in to steal an American phrase and use it for China, China has provided a high fence and actually quite a large yard for its own tech development. So there's an interesting question that if the US does go to actually restricting Chinese technology, ByteDance in this case, with TikTok, will it encourage the US to develop more and better apps of its own within that market? Now, the US has obviously been much more open than China to technology from outside in the last 10 to 15 years. But if we see a trend in the other direction, China's own experience suggests that actually shutting off your tech market does not necessarily mean that you can't innovate. It just goes in different directions.
In terms of the global economy, Keyu, I want to talk about inflation, that bugbear of the last couple of years. That's been falling, so much so that the European Central Bank has abandoned its crisis-era strategy. But now everyone's talking about reducing budget deficits, raising taxes and cutting spending. Those are really painful economic choices to make. What's your outlook?
First, as has been previously mentioned, what is going to happen to inflation is still very much in the air. with Trump's proposed tariff plans. So we are about to see what that means. You know, from the last time around, it's very visible that trade costs have increased and price rising have been borne, especially by American consumers. And we are also seeing that in the last few years, the rerouting of trade through the likes of Vietnam and Mexico is just taking a longer time to get to where it was supposed to go anyways, have increased costs. So I think there's still potential significant pressure there. But reducing budget deficits or reducing government spending raising taxes in times of economic downturns is not really quite the textbook policy to propose. That would be pro-cyclical policy. So the timing is very important. Of course, reducing aggregate demand will help alleviate some of the inflationary pressures, but this also could propel, greater weakness in the economy. And Europe has long-term structural economic problems. So I think that without really raising productivity and resolving some of these structural issues, this is just going to be a very painful choice.
David, I want to zone in a little bit more on partnerships, collaboration, cooperation, and how the plate tectonics might change. I mean, do you anticipate more of a focus maybe between China and the global south in 2025? I mean, tariffs have been relaxed with LDCs, least developed countries. China's big infrastructure investment scheme, Belt and Road Initiative, has opened new markets. Where do you see things moving?
Well, I do think we'll see things move in that direction. I mean, the bottom line is I think China has come to the conclusion, which I think is an understandable conclusion from its perspective, that the United States has become a very unreliable partner and is likely to become even less reliable in a second Trump term from the standpoint of trade, from the standpoint of technology and collaboration in a variety of other areas. Yes, there are some issues where the United States and China can and do still work together. But in these broad areas relating to the economy, the global economy, trade, high technology, et cetera, there's a massive wariness on the part of the United States that we've seen inform U.S. policy and U.S. actions toward China over the last decade or even longer. And China is very cognizant of that. And so I think there will be a move toward other partners that China regards as more reliable. And where there is greater upside potential for the development of more robust trade and commercial and economic relationships, whether that's the global south, whether that's in some cases even Europe, to the extent that it's not always the case that Europe looks at some of these issues exactly the same way that the United States does. And I think there will be opportunities that China will seek to exploit to reduce its own dependency on the United States as a kind of, if you will, defensive measure, because the United States is doing that relative to China, and will seek to enhance its relationships with countries all across the world. And I think we've seen evidence over the last several years that that is effective, and that while the United States policies and actions with respect to tariffs and with respect to restrictiveness around Chinese investment in the United States and the transfer of U.S. technology and know-how to China and so on, that has had an impact on U.S.-China commercial relations. We've also seen a kind of inverse effect already in terms of some growth in China's relationships with other countries. I think we're going to see that continue in 2025.
Well, we've been talking quite a lot about China's growth with other countries, but Keyu, I do want to talk about the shift that's happening within China, that big shift that we've seen for so many years, and the monetary policy becoming more loose, moderately loose. What impact do you think that is going to have on China at home and the global economy more broadly, Keyu?
Well, first of all, I think the signal of a commitment to unleash massive government stimulus, monetary, fiscal, in a coordinated fashion is the most important element to boost confidence and signal for future, where the economy is going, especially by bringing back growth as the absolute priority of the nation. At the same time, the accommodatively loose monetary policy was only mentioned in 2009, the last time. So this does imply that there will be more aggressive monetary easing. Yeah. Now, the question is what kind of tools, how are they going to be implemented, the degree, all of this is still in question. I think the government is still trying to test out and discuss about how this will be carried forward. But it is in accorded fashion with fiscal policy, with a healthy amount of boost to the real estate sector. The question today, still most importantly, is whether that money actually trickles to the real economy, or is it just to reduce local government debt and remain in the financial system and not actually affect the real economy. So that's probably why we're waiting to see whether there will be significant boosts in confidence in spending in the next few months. But the commitment, I believe, is there.
We've talked a lot about global politics and economics, but 2024 was a big year for continuing conflict in the Middle East and Ukraine in particular. Rana, how do you see that playing out in 2025, and who might be the key players in bringing about peace?
Well, I would say that despite the desire of the Trump administration to put forward the idea that America is not going to get involved in the world, the level of American power in the world built up over 3/4 of a century is such that I think they're not going to have that option. And in answer to your question more directly, I would say that I think we should expect some quite fundamental shifts in terms of some key relationships. First of all, I think it's very clear that the Trump administration wants to do some sort of negotiation, at least with Vladimir Putin, on the question of Ukraine. And I think it is still just not clear quite how that's going to end up. Interestingly, in a recent interview at the end of 2024, in an interview with Kristen Welker of NBC, Donald Trump actually sort of stepped back from the idea that NATO was something he simply kind of wouldn't countenance, and talked instead about the need for European partners to pay more in terms of input to the organization, which doesn't suggest an abandonment of the NATO structures, but that is going to be relevant in terms of what kind of arrangement can be made that looks anything like a just peace for Ukraine. And of course, the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, the Russian invasion, sits absolutely at the center of how that will affect global order. Linked to that, I think we can expect that probably there'll be a new start in the Middle East. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu and President-elect Trump have a quite probably cooperative relationship in a way that the outgoing Biden administration, for good or ill, doesn't seem to have had in quite the same sort of a way. Person-to-person diplomacy, and particularly leader-to-leader diplomacy, maybe just more of a tonal shift in what we see in the US in the next few years. The one thing I don't think it actually means is genuine withdrawal from the wider world on the part of the United States. My own personal feeling is that's simply not possible.
David, I wonder what your take is on all of that, particularly zoning in on Ukraine, because Donald Trump has called for an immediate ceasefire, saying it's time to act. China can help. The world is waiting.
Well, I think the Ukraine issue, the Russia-Ukraine war, is a very difficult issue to solve to the satisfaction of all involved. And I personally predict that that particular conflict is going to continue deep into 2025, if not beyond, despite President-elect Trump's comments about Ukraine and expressed desire for a quick and easy solution. I fall into the camp that believes that if there were a quick and easy solution to that issue, that it would have already been generated by the various players who've been dealing with this for nearly 3 years. The fact is, what Russia wants and what Ukraine wants from a bottom line perspective are just fundamentally incompatible. Ukraine wants Humpty Dumpty to be put back together. They want their country to be whole again and its sovereignty to be respected. That seems very unlikely to happen under the current leadership in Russia and Vladimir Putin as president of Russia. And it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where a satisfactory resolution is generated either at the initiative of the United States or China, for that matter, or any other players that are trying to mediate. So I think what we're going to see is a kind of continuation of this conflict as far as the eye can see. And I hope that I'm wrong in predicting that, and I hope that there is a level of wisdom and perseverance in terms of the diplomatic process that can yield some sort of better status quo than what we see right now. But I'm not optimistic, I have to say, about that.
Keyu, it seems 2025 is going to be dominated by crisis management, lots of challenges and the world really treading water. But I wonder if you see any opportunity. What would you say the big opportunity is for the world in 2025?
I think we're seeing explosive growth in some of the technological areas, and whether that can improve well-being, reduce poverty, give new opportunities to developing worlds who should live with more dignity, and including in healthcare and in medicine. I think that that is going to bring a great amount of optimism to the world.
Rana, same question to you. Do you see any opportunity, and if so, where?
Yeah, I think one of the things that overall we still see broadly around the world is that education levels are becoming higher and higher. And that relates a little bit to Keyu's excellent point about technology. If you want better technology, you have to have better educated populations. And overall, over time, even though there are many setbacks and a lot of work to do, it's clear that we are dealing with a world where people are getting more education. There are terrible, dark spots. I mean, I think the treatment of women in Afghanistan, we have to sort of flag up as one of the most awful backward moves in terms of education for women there. But overall, I think it's fair to say that the combination of greater life expectancies around the world, which again is another big plus, and populations becoming better able to actually use education will feed in over time to a better world, even though it may take us a little while to see it.
And David, as you settle into 2025, what positives are out there for you?
Well, I think there are going to be some continued challenges in the world, but I hope and believe that 2025 may see a relative stabilization of the global picture, both from the standpoint of the geopolitics and the economics. And just in terms of U.S.-China relations, for example, there's been a narrative in the United States that these are two countries that are on the cusp of major military conflagration. I don't see that happening in 2025 or anytime in the foreseeable future. And I think that with care and with effort on the part of the leaders of the various players, the key countries in the world that are involved in many of these conflicts, that we can avoid worst case scenarios. And I think we will do that in 2025. So while that may not be unqualified optimism, I would say it is optimistic relative to some of the trend lines that we've seen in the last couple of years.
David Firestein, Keyu, Rana, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.